Good morning, everyone. Don't be afraid to sit towards the front. Remember I'm usually in the back, kind of waving people down here. We have a wonderful distinguished visiting lecture today to do grand rounds. But before we get started on that, we have a special surprise guest, Dean Tolar. I don't even know what the agenda item is, so I'm just going to turn it over to the Dean, and we will all listen eagerly.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Vinogrado. Thank you, everyone. This is truly an impromptu, thing. I'm just in the middle of my patients upstairs in my clinic, and I thought, that I would come and thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for everything that you think about, how the school and the UMP can be better, and that confidence that I hope you can renew in yourselves every day, as I do, when we all experience small frictions or big frictions in our professional lives, that we somehow get back to the opportunities that we have. And that confidence, I think, is well-founded. It's not a, cheerleading maneuver at all. It is something that I see, as a background of the clinical compensation that we were able to negotiate for our physicians and staff, the ability to get extra funding for the academic pursuits. This is a significant funding that's probably one of the best, if not the best, in the country, in a partnership of a community healthcare system and academic institutions such as our medical school. And then, I'm immensely proud, of the changes that have been made in the standards of operations, and as well as in quality and safety. And lastly, in the funding for the school. So you have, and your colleagues have brought 40% more funding from external sources, it's like NIH, NSF, and so forth, 40% more this year than last year. That's almost unimaginably great. And so thank you for that as well. The reason why, I stand here at the permission of Dr. Vinogradov is that you have phenomenal chair. She's the one who is not one of my closest advisors, and I hope she would agree, because I seek her guidance and advice on multitude of things, not all of them related to psychiatry. And she's a fierce advocate for the faculty and staff, and for rationality, for sanity in what we do, and conversely, the insanity of what we do and should not be doing at all. So thank you for that. Couple of updates, changes with the Fairview that you have probably seen in the paper. This is a part of the process. This is a dynamic equilibrium that has, parts of the adaptation to the markets that we face, and we are standing as partners to Fairview Health System as a true partner. And James Hereford and I are very closely aligned on how to do the right thing by the people that work in the corporations, and also obviously by the patients. The second update is those of you who are trainees or educators, please keep in mind that we have the LCME visit coming in early 2020. This is very important for the well-being of the school, and it's extremely relevant, to everything we do, because the training is an essential part of what we do, as it is in clinical care and in research. Lastly, there is a transition at the CEO position of the University of Minnesota Physicians, or M Physicians. This has transferred from Dr. Konade to Dr. Yu. He is incredibly capable of leading the corporation from this position. He and I are working very closely, and there is it's absolutely seamless. We have met this morning, Barb knows that. We have met this morning in the forum on the other bank, and we will be working very, very closely together. So again, thank you very much for everything you do. Please know that I am open to any advice, any question, any suggestion that you may have, and grateful for everything you do. Thank you all. Any questions for me right now? If not, that's okay. That's okay. You didn't know I would be here, so that's okay. But please, everybody knows, I answer all the feedback I get, that little button, on my messages. My office is open to you. There's open hours in the dean's office. I use all the possible menu items that I can think of, how to better communicate. I think communication is essential, paramount. And please know that even if you come with a request for money, space, more time in a day, as most people come to my office with, I still learn from you. I still learn from, whatever, is painful for you is an important information for me, because that's where I think, the leadership has to be applied and has to be meaningful to you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Lydia Zalowska, faculty here. I lead the effort here to bring wellness offerings to mental health world in our department. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Henry Emmons, who's a nationally known psychiatrist who integrates mind-body approaches, natural therapies, mindfulness, and neuroscience into his clinical work. Dr. Emmons practices here in Minneapolis with partners in Resilience Group, and he's also a co-founder of naturalmentalhealth.com website, which offers information and holistic products to support resilience and mental health well-being. Dr. Emmons is also an author of several books, The Chemistry of Joy, The Chemistry of Calm, and Staying Sharp. He has developed the resilience training program that's been used in clinics around the city. He conducts workshops on integrative mental health, and he is frequently sought after retreat leader for both healthcare professionals and the general public. And on a personal note, when I was moving here from California 3 years ago, I called Dr. Emmons out of the blue. He did not know me. I've known of him, and he's been very generous with his time talking to me about the field of integrative mental health here, and a very welcoming presence in Twin Cities when I moved here. So I am just delighted that he's here and able to talk to us about his work. Please help me welcome Dr. Emmons.
Thank you, Lydia. And thank you for inviting me and for having me here. I've had a really warm, wonderful reception. So far, it's a little bit like coming home for me, or coming full circle, because 30 years ago this fall, my very first job was in this hospital, in this very hospital. And last night we had dinner at a lovely restaurant that was 3 blocks from where I used to live when I lived in the Twin Cities. So this has been a really nice experience already. So I am talking a little bit today about what is known as integrative mental health or integrative psychiatry. And I just want to let you know how I think about that and how I want to talk about that. So to me, the word integrative simply means that we are talking about blending together in a coherent, at least as coherent a way as we can, all of the different types of things that might help our patients to recover, to feel better, to restore their health. It's really nothing more than that, at least in my view. So it's pretty simple. It's common sense in a way. But it's the sort of common sense that I think we often lose sight of, or we lose maybe the time for it, or the nature of our practice, our clinical work doesn't really lend itself well to that. So part of what I'm going to do today is to tell a story. I'll include a little bit of my own story about just how I have moved in that direction and why I think it's a really sound direction for us as a field. So, this is a term that I think used to be known as holistic mental health or holistic medicine or complementary medicine. I think that the term integrative is probably a little more neutral, which is maybe a good thing. And I think it's, again, it's just, in my view, there's nothing radical or magical about it. It's just good common sense blending. So part of this, in my own background and experience, part of this stems from my training. I went to the University of Iowa for medical school, and a lot of you probably trained here at Minnesota, there's a lot of similarities between at least historically, between the psychiatry departments. And at that time, this is 30-some years ago, at that time, the Midwestern Big Ten schools were really known as being really kind of at the forefront of biological research. But they weren't as well known for incorporating psychodynamic training or psychotherapy or any kind of maybe more holistic approaches. So I ended up, because I was interested in that, I ended up seeking this out. And I went and did my training in the East in New York at University of Rochester, so Rochester, New York, upstate. And the reason I chose that, probably none of you know this, but Rochester is where the term biopsychosocial model really was developed. And so it was really one of the very first places to think outside the biomedical box and be thinking a little bit more broadly about including things like the social milieu, the context, the family, and so forth. And it's also, just before my arrival there, it's where some of the very first really good mind-body research was done, psychoneuroimmunology research. Some of the very first studies were done there. So there were people there that I just really wanted to learn from and grow with. And then my first job, as I mentioned, part of my time was here in this hospital. It was with Group Health, which is now Health Partners, so you all are familiar with that. And it was a staff model HMO, which for me at that time, in my very first job out of training, was a really great place, a really good place for me to learn. I saw lots and lots of patients. I had great colleagues. I think there were 15 or 16 psychiatrists in our group, and so people I could learn from that were more experienced and very congenial. It was a really great place. But after 5 years, I was there for 5 years only, I realized that the role of the psychiatrist in that kind of a system was really narrowly defined, and it probably wasn't going to change much. And I didn't know what it might be like in other places outside of the staff model HMO, so I wanted to discover that. And the role of the psychiatrist, you probably know, was basically to evaluate lots of people, especially crisis kinds of work, and to manage their medications. It's good work, but it was not something I imagined would be satisfying for me for my whole career. So after 5 years, I decided to venture out into the community, took a job with a primary care clinic in Northfield, where I still live, and thinking that was going to give me a lot more autonomy, control over my practice, and I quickly realized that I was in way over my head. It was a very different style of practice. I no longer had colleagues that I could talk with or turn to when I needed help. I was the only psychiatrist in a very big geographic area, so I got tons of new patients coming my way, each one seemingly having more struggling more than the last, and I was just really overwhelmed. So I did this for 3 years, and I burned out. I had a very early midlife crisis, I think you'd say. And so at that point, I don't know if you remember this, some of you do, but there was a fellowship offered by the Bush Foundation for what was called mid-career physicians. You could argue whether I was in my mid-career. I was only 7 years out of my training, but I applied for this, basically a sabbatical program, and I got it, which was a graceful way for me to kind of retool and shift my direction. And what I studied in that sabbatical, I did mine over 2 years. So I really had 2 years to dive into this. And I studied the kind of things that had always interested me, but I had not had any real experience or opportunity to learn deeply in my training. And those were things like I'm doing today still. I was interested in 3 things: natural therapies for mental health problems, so looking at diet, nutritional products, herbs, acupuncture, A lot of things that now might be considered naturopathic, a good naturopathic training. The second area of interest was mindfulness, as I could apply it to mental health. So even earlier, while I was at Group Health, I studied with John Kabat-Zinn to learn how to do the mindfulness-based stress reduction. This was really early in that kind of that movement. And so after my training, when I came back to Group Health, I just said, I'm going to offer this group therapy. And nobody knew what it was. They just heard group therapy. They referred their patients to it. And I very quickly realized this is a really effective, really helpful tool for patients with these mental health problems. So during my sabbatical, I wanted to learn more about how to use the language, how to use those kind of skills and techniques specifically around problems like anxiety and depression. The third area of my interest during this sabbatical was really about professional renewal and kind of sustainability. It was how to think about helping others who might have had similar problems of feeling burned out and kind of depleted by their practice, about how to turn that around so that we could be thinking about how to have an entire career that was sustainable, that was doable, that we didn't, just succumb to the problems that we're all now very, very much aware of. So I'm going to try to weave all of these things into this talk this morning. I won't say a lot more about my own kind of career trajectory, but I'll throw a little bit in from time to time, and I'd be happy to take questions at the end. I do want to just, by way of disclosure, say that I have published these books. I have co-founded this website that Lydia referred to. I'm not going to be talking about anything that I have any financial or other interest in during this talk, but just so that you're clear, I do have those other things going on. And then the last piece of business I want to attend to before I launch into my talk is to refer to this movie that probably a lot of you are too young to even know what I'm talking about here. But this is a movie called City Slickers with Billy Crystal and Jack Palance here on the old crusty cowboy. And in this movie, Billy Crystal portrays a kind of another early midlife crisis. He was living in the city and just not happy. And so his friends convinced him that the way to find some happiness was to go to this dude ranch where they met Curly, the cowboy. And throughout the movie then, Curly kept referring to the one thing. There's just one thing you could do. You can see he's holding up his finger here again, or Billy Crystal is. But he wouldn't ever tell him what it is. He just kind of kept it a tightly held secret. But presumably, if they knew this, they would discover how to be happy themselves. They discover how to live a more meaningful life. At the end of the movie where this scene is taking place, Billy Crystal is just badgering him like he does so well. He's just about broken him down, and Curly is finally going to reveal the one thing. And then he has a heart attack, falls off his horse, and dies. So he doesn't learn it from him. He figured it out on his own. But I am here to tell you that if I am still standing at the end of this talk, I will reveal to you the one thing that you can do. There is a quotation or quote attributed to Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind. And I just love this quote as a way of framing a talk like this. She said, "Every problem has two handles. You can grab it by the handle of fear or the handle of hope." And what I intend to do is to try to grab this problem, which I'll define in a minute, but grab it by the handle of hope as much as possible. And this is really what I think an integrative approach is trying to do. It's trying to give people as many skills and methods and opportunities to take charge of their own health, to create a more hopeful approach to their illness as much as we possibly can. So first, the problem. We do need to talk about the problem. In the conversations I've had already in my visit here, we've talked quite a bit about this because it's coming so to the surface now that people in our culture, particularly younger generations, and also particularly people in medical fields, are really struggling to keep themselves afloat, to keep themselves resilient. So I want to just give you a little bit of a frame, a way of thinking about what is happening that is eroding people's resilience. Mental illness has always been here. We know that historically. It's written about in the Bible and other ancient texts. Depression is nothing new. Manic depression is nothing new. But what is different is the numbers of people that are experiencing distress and experiencing these things. So one window into this is epidemiologic studies that started 100 years ago, in 1910 actually. And so every decade, along with the U.S. Census, there's been a scientific sampling of people in the U.S. to try to get a snapshot of the relative mental health of our population. And so they're asking, this is of course started before the DSM was even thought of, but they're asking the very same kinds of questions that now show up in the DSM. So what they've seen from this, if you looked at this as a graph, you'd see that about every data point, every 10 years, there's been another 10% or so increase in rates of mental health problems, the numbers of people that are experiencing emotional distress of some sort, 10% increase. So now with 10 data points, 10% increase every time, it's going up somewhat exponentially. It's going up much more than just 100% in that time. Martin Seligman, who some of you know about from positive psychology, he says it this way. He says that if you're born after World War II, now virtually most everyone in our country, your chances of developing depression are about 10 times greater than if you'd been born at the turn of the last century. Now, whether that number is really accurate or not, we could argue about, but I don't think many people would disagree that these kinds of problems are on the rise. One of my personal observations into this is that I have been working in college mental health part-time for the last 25 years, ever since I moved to Northfield. Started doing college mental health at the 2 schools in Northfield, and then eventually added some schools up here. And at one time, I was in 7 different small liberal arts schools in the Twin Cities and around. And so I had this opportunity to witness the changes firsthand, kind of front lines, if you will, changes in that age group in terms of how much mental distress they're experiencing and what kinds of diagnoses and how severe the diagnoses are. And you probably are familiar with Boynton's own survey about this, which is a really, really good survey. And it's happening everywhere. It's not just here in Minnesota. It's all around the country that the percentage of college students who are distressed enough that it is affecting their ability to function, which is how we define these things as an illness, has gone up dramatically in the last 15 to 25 years. Rates of suicide, a recent study showing that there's been an increase of 24% of ER visits for suicidality, double the rate from just 2007 in kids and teens. That's a really fast, really dramatic rise. And then disability. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but the number one cause of disability in the United States is depression. And it has been for quite some time. That has not been true in other parts of the world, particularly the less developed countries. They've had, unless their statistics aren't as carefully kept, they've had much lower rates of depression, but that is rapidly changing. So the World Health Organization now considers this to be something of a worldwide epidemic. And they estimate that in just a few years, depression will be the number one cause of disability worldwide. I don't want to leave out what's happening in our own world. And this is a survey from the Mayo Clinic, who's done quite a bit on this notion of this problem of physician burnout. But I can tell you that this is not limited to physicians. This is happening with everybody in healthcare. And what this is showing is that over 50% of practicing physicians are showing signs of burnout. If you read that list, it looks very much like a description of depression. I think it's just a different face of depression. And the majority of practicing physicians would not recommend medicine as a career for their own children. I mentioned that, early on when I did my sabbatical, this is one of the things I was interested in. And 20 years ago, this year, I started a program with the Center for Spirituality and Healing here at the university. We ran this program for about 8 or 9 years. It was called the Inner Life of Healers. And it was really a retreat-based renewal program, engaging people in deeper, more meaningful conversations about their work. That's not the only solution to this problem, but it was a really, really helpful, really interesting way of working with people. And I think that you're doing some great things here at the university and here in the psychiatry department about this, but this is something we really need to keep our focus on. So through the rest of the talk, bear in mind, this is not just for our patients. This is something we need to be thinking about and attending to for ourselves just as much. I want to talk a little bit about how I see the field of psychiatry. This is my own opinion, my own view of history, but how I see it having evolved over the last century or so. I put biological at the start because I actually think that if you go back, before Freud came up with his psychodynamic theories, that most of psychiatry at that time was really more biological in orientation. Freud himself was a neurologist. It's said that, throughout his career, he believed that his psychodynamic theories were just a placeholder. They were just something to try to help people until we really understood more about the biology of behind some of these mental health problems. So I really think that our history going way back was biological. And then, of course, psychodynamic theory kind of took hold. Around the time that I entered the field, and some of you in here also may have entered the field, right around the time that the insurance industry was really changing the nature of medical practice. I'm not saying this was good or bad. We can argue about that, but I don't think there's much question that it is part of what changed how we do things. I came from the East Coast where I trained here to Minnesota working for a staff model HMO. So I kind of leaped right into the heart of this change, which was, that's kind of one end of the spectrum. But what I think has happened is that psychiatry has been defined more and more narrowly, in part by how we are reimbursed and what we are reimbursed for. And so, in your training, hopefully you're getting a very broad training. You're learning to do psychotherapy. Once you get out there in practice, it's pretty hard to do much of that. It's hard to do much beyond medication management because that's what insurance has defined as the role for a psychiatrist. I think we're complicit in that because I think we as a institution kind of allowed that to happen. I know that there were voices kind of arguing against it because I was there for that. I saw that. But yet, here we are. And I think it's very hard to have a psychiatric career and define your own way of working more than is currently happening. I think it was the 1990s that the NIMH dedicated as the decade of the brain. This was just after my training. And it was a really hopeful, kind of optimistic time when the goal was to really understand mental illness and understand it from the brain perspective and recognize it as an illness as opposed to some just something that a person is doing wrong in their lives. And a lot was learned during that time, but we did not get those answers in the way that we really wanted to. We didn't really change the nature of practice very much. And in the years that I was at Health Partners, Group Health and Health Partners, I witnessed a really big pendulum shift from initially, when I first came in 1989, therapists were quite reluctant to refer their patients for a psychiatric evaluation because they didn't really want them to go on medications yet. They wanted to give them some time, do some therapy first. And the belief at that time, widely held, was that medications might suppress the ability to really do good work in therapy. So that was the initial point of view. And it wasn't that psychiatrists weren't getting referrals, believe me. We were plenty busy. But people were reluctant yet to use medication as the main treatment. And then over that 5 years, and then the next few years after that, I saw a huge change where people were referred right away for medication management. They got on meds immediately. And not only that, but I was actually part of this. We started training primary care clinicians to do the prescribing themselves so that we wouldn't kind of miss people, so people could get care out in the primary care setting, because there's not enough of us mental health professionals to go around. So that brings us to where we are now, treatment, what I call treatment as usual. And I'm going to give you a particular point of view about this. So there's a website here, a list at the bottom, called minnesotahealthscores.org. And it's a systematic attempt to measure how effectively we as a healthcare system are treating a few big problems. One of them is diabetes, there's, I think, heart disease, and then there's depression. And so they're measuring rates of recovery from depression by using a PHQ-9. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Now, what you may not know, because we live in a little bit of a bubble within mental health, what you may not know is that the vast majority of psychotropics are not prescribed by psychiatrists or psychiatric nurses. They are prescribed by primary care clinicians, the vast majority. And so in a primary care setting, that's what this is looking at. People are given this questionnaire. It takes about 4 minutes or less to fill out. I was given this questionnaire when I went in for a shoulder problem. I don't know if they do it at every visit or if I just looked kind of unhappy that day, but I did get the questionnaire. And so by definition, if your score is greater than 9 on this questionnaire, you are considered to possibly have a problem with clinical depression and offered treatment. And what is the treatment that's offered? It's almost always an SSRI medication. And then, by definition, remission is considered to be a score of less than 5 at the end of 6 months. So that's the definitions that are used. I don't know if those are the right definitions. I'm guessing they're not. But here's what it shows. In the state, 115 clinics participating, only 10 have a remission rate of around 25%, a quarter. Remission. The average is under 10%. Now, when I did my training, I remember learning very clearly that the natural course of clinical depression, major depression, if nothing was done, it just was allowed to play out over time. In 6 months to a year, roughly 40 or 50% of people should have recovered. This study, we're seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 25%. That is so poor that I actually don't believe it's really that bad, but I do think it's telling us what we're doing is not working. There's a couple of other problems I want to just point out that I think are happening, and this is kind of showing us. One is, I think that it's often under-recognized that side effects from medications, if the doses are high enough or people end up on several medications, the side effects themselves can look like depression. And this questionnaire does not sort that out for you. So you're using just this raw data to make decisions, possibly not factoring in that it's the medication that's making the person more tired, kind of flattening their mood, causing a loss of sexual interest, and so forth. I also fear, this is my perspective, because I see so many patients. They come to me thinking I'm a holistic physician. I'm going to take them off their medication. I don't do that all the time, I want you to know. But that's what they come to me for. And so I see this constantly, and that is, I think a large number of these people who are prescribed an SSRI for what looks like depression don't actually have depression. I think a large number, more than half, maybe 80%, don't have major depression. What do you think they have? I think they have an adjustment disorder. Does that mean they shouldn't be treated? No. It does not mean they shouldn't be treated, even with a medication. But it does mean, in my personal view, that they should be offered skills, they should be offered therapy, they should be given something in addition to or instead of the medication so that this does not continue happening. If nothing changes other than there's some temporary symptom relief, it's just going to keep happening. So that's one problem. Second problem is, I believe that many of these people that are prescribed a medication for what should be a temporary problem are kept on the medication for so long that they have a hard time getting off of it. So this is, I think, a very big national problem. I think there's so many people taking meds long-term, and believe me, I have no problem with that when someone has recurrent major depression. I think that's the right course of treatment. I do have concerns about it when it is something that should have been temporary, and now they have a second problem that is long-term and really hard to deal with. And I'll just add this. Many of you know this because you've seen a lot of patients yourself. If somebody has been on an SSRI or any antidepressant for 10, 15, 20 years, taking them off of it can be incredibly destabilizing, even if they never actually had major depression. Just because they've been on the med for so long, it can be really hard to get off. So that I seldom recommend that. I actually usually discourage people from totally getting off the medication, but I do try to help them with some of the more integrative therapies to get the meds working better, possibly to get the doses lower if that's feasible, and to do other things that might change the long-term course of their illness. So my point is, I think we can do better than we're doing. I think even though mental health professionals may not see the majority of these patients, I think we can offer leadership in how these kind of conditions are treated. And I also think that a lot of patients are seeking this out. People are looking for alternatives. They're looking for other ways to do this. And not everybody, but a lot of people are looking for something they can do for themselves and not just rely on a medication. So I want to then tell you a little bit about a treatment approach that I was part of at the Penny George Institute. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it is a holistic or integrative medical clinic embedded within Abbott Hospital. It's part of Allina, and it's really been a kind of a national model, forerunner, if you will. It has not had a big mental health presence. I think they have a couple of therapists there now, but at the time I was there a few years ago, I was really the only mental health person aside from one person doing hypnotherapy. But I was invited to come in and start a program that was based on my first book, The Chemistry of Joy, which was about a holistic approach to depression. And I want to just tell you a little bit about how that program looks and what sort of results we've been seeing with it. So essentially, it's pretty simple. It's combining these three things: good nutrition, to try to deal with brain chemistry first through diet, if possible. Second, through some nutritional supplement products, if possible. And then when it's needed, thirdly, medications. We use fitness or movement because there's so much evidence that it's an effective treatment for depression. And then we incorporate mindfulness, and that's really the bulk of the program, but these other pieces are really, really important. There are a couple of unique aspects to this that not every place could replicate, because the Penny George Institute had such good resources. Some of that was philanthropic funding, but we had our own clinical functional nutritionist. She practiced functional nutrition. We had our own fitness center, so we were able to do really good fitness evaluations on everybody. And then everybody saw me. Everybody who participated in the program first had an interview with me where I would try to take a really broad view of what's going on. I would try to talk about other things they could be doing, what they could be focusing on from a more holistic perspective. I might add some nutritional products, just a few. And then occasionally, very rarely, but occasionally I would add or change their medications. What I found was that more often than not, I would be reducing their medications because they were on several. And I felt that they'd become part of the problem. Everybody saw our nutritionist at least 2 or 3 times, which was really key because getting an individualized diet recommendation is very different than just telling everybody to eat a certain way. The Mediterranean diet is great, but people are built differently and they have different nutritional needs. And one of the things she would look at is how does food play into the perpetuation of the stress response? Are digestive problems making it hard for them to get the nutrients that they need out of their food? Are there food sensitivities or other causes of inflammation that is kind of just prolonging the depression? And then it's also really key that everybody had their own individualized approach to fitness or movement. I can't emphasize enough how much difference I think it makes when these recommendations are individualized to the patient. So we started this program and ran it for about 3 or 4 years before doing this study that I'm going to tell you about. And I want to just tell you how the study happened because I think it's really relevant. So initially, this program was just offered to the public. Anybody who heard about it could come. We ran these groups several times a year. We had around 20 patients per group. And it is really skills-based. It's not a therapy group. It's definitely not a replacement for psychotherapy. But we taught people how to use mindfulness skills to deal more successfully with their emotional life and with the thoughts that are often kind of behind those emotions. And so it's not exactly an MBSR class, but it incorporates some of that and then some additional things that I thought were just more relevant for mood problems. So that we've been doing it for about 3 or 4 years. And then the Alina HR department, Human Resources, learned about what we were doing, and they were interested. Why were they interested? Because Alina is a big organization, it's self-insured, and every year they got the data that the most expensive condition for their own employees was depression was always near the top. It was one of the top 3 every year for the 10 years before this study. So they were looking for an alternate way of dealing with depression for their own healthcare employees. So what we did then, we had, we had a research department. That was the other thing they had. They had their own research department, which was really nice. And we had everybody do a scheduled interview to make sure that what we were treating was major depression. And here are a couple of things I want to tell you about. One is that we advertised this through the employee website, which I was really skeptical. I thought, we're not going to get anybody to do this group. For one thing, does anybody really look at the employee website? And then if they did, do they want to do a group with their peers and so forth? So I'm not a researcher, and I was skeptical. In the first 2 weeks that this was posted, this is the only posting, we had 450 phone calls, which I think tells you how much distress healthcare professionals are under and how much they're looking for a different way to do things. I think it's that simple. We couldn't take that many, obviously, but we did these interviews. We filtered out anybody who had more than one diagnosis. It was just major depression, and made sure that we weren't treating an adjustment disorder. So we had a really good base of patients. Now we had two groups, and so the second group served as a wait list control. So it was just a pilot study, very simple pilot study. But the wait list control, while they waited their 6 months before participating in the program, they filled out these questionnaires I'll show you in a moment. And based on that, we determined whether there was an improvement from going through the program or not. So the next few slides are all looking at that. First thing we did, same questionnaire, the PHQ-9 that we talked about before. And what we found, the two treatment groups are the kind of greenish and reddish lines. The blue line is the control group. What we found is that on average, people's PHQ-9 score was pretty high to begin with. It was around 13 and a half. At the end of the program, everybody improved. Not everyone by definition, reached remission. But everybody improved, and 60% of people did reach full remission. 60%. Remember the slide I showed you before? At best, it's around 20 or 25%. And remember, we are not using, in this study, I did not prescribe any medications. It was all skills-based, psychosocials and skills-based. So PHQ-9 improved. I don't have this slide for you, but we did 6-month and 12-month follow-up. And with all of these measures, they looked virtually the same. So the improvement, even though we had no contact with them after this 8 weeks, the improvement stuck for at least a year. Second thing we looked at was the quality of life scale. And you can see again, for the two treatment groups that improved all of these are statistically significant. You're going to notice the blue line actually shows improvement in almost all these slides, even though they're just waiting. It's not statistically significant, but I think it means something. I think that simply having taken some action and having a little bit of hope that maybe there is something you're going to do for yourself that is going to make a difference in that, I think people already, the treatment, if you will, already begins. We did perceived stress scale. This is the important part of stress, I think. It's not how much stress you're actually under, it's how much you perceive yourself to be under, and that improved, again, significantly. We did state and trait anxiety, and you'll remember probably that state anxiety, which you see here, is how much anxiety you carry in the moment. Hopefully that would improve, and it does. But we also see an improvement in trait anxiety. And that is a much harder thing to change. That's sort of that baseline, how much tension or stress or anxiety do people tend to carry with them. We looked at health-promoting lifestyles. Are people able to do, because we're asking them to do a lot of things here, are they able to actually do them? And you probably know the data on this. If you tell your patient in an office visit to exercise more, what are the chances that they're going to do that? It's practically zero. And in this study, for whatever reason, people actually made some changes, and they seem to be enduring. I think it has to do largely with the fact that it was so individualized, and also because there was a lot of group support and constant reinforcement. Even though the group was mostly mindfulness skills, we'd always be reinforcing more of the lifestyle factors. I think those two things really make a difference in adherence, which is the key for those kind of practices. We looked at sleep quality, which also improved significantly. People were getting on average probably about 5 or 6 hours of sleep, and it went up closer to the range we want, which is closer to 7. We looked at, this is the final slide for this study, we looked at productivity. This was really the bottom line from the HR perspective. They wanted to know if this was cost effective. You can imagine a program like this was not cheap. It was, I think the total cost to the the patients were $900, and so this was funded by the study. But they wanted to know if they were getting a return on that investment. And because we didn't have the money to do a long study looking at did it reduce healthcare expenses, that'd be a much better study for this. Instead, what they looked at is just work productivity. And so they looked at something called presenteeism. You may know what that is, but I think of it as it's when you go to work, you don't have to stay home, you go to work, but you're not getting much done because of an illness. And so what they found is that presenteeism improved. In other words, their ability to work while they are at work improved enough that for every, here you see this at the bottom, it's a little hard to read, but for every dollar spent, they got back close to $3 in improved productivity. And based on that alone, and then this other data that I showed you, we were able to take this to Blue Cross, which was their insurer, Alina's insurer, and show them this data, and Blue Cross agreed that they were going to cover this. They'd cover it at 85% for Alina employees for the foreseeable future. It's hard sometimes to get these mind-body or alternative, more holistic programs to be covered. It's really, really important, I think, that we work on that. So I'm going to take a little time here talking about why is this effective? Why does this approach work when treatment as usual appears not to be as effective? And I'm going to talk about it in these three aspects of scientific inquiry. I'm going to go through this pretty superficially, and I know a lot of you know much more about this than I'm going to be referencing today, but I think it's just a nice frame to work with and to think about why might we want to do more integrative work. So the first thing is genetic expression, or epigenetics. And I have really come to see the power in this way of thinking because so many of our patients, especially somebody with depression who's been depressed for most of their life, whose family members, half or more of them, seem to be depressed or alcoholic, and they just look at this and say, I am doomed. You know, my genes are against me. This is just something I have and I'm going to have to deal with. There is a little bit of truth to that, of course. Our genetics do make a difference in whether we're prone to these illnesses or not. But what I like to focus on, again, grabbing it by the handle of hope, I like to focus on what can we do to try to modify the genetics. Not the DNA, but the epigenetics, the overlay. I think of it as there's a series of channels that go from the DNA into the cell, and it's those channels that determine, if they're open or closed, they determine whether that gene is going to be expressed or not. And there's some things we can do to sort of turn off the illness genes, or there's other things that might turn them on, and we need to understand more about that. But here's some things we do understand. Some of the negative things that activate illness genes we all know about. It's alcohol, tobacco, endocrine disruptors, things that are in the food and plastics and so forth, and the effects of long-term stress. And this is really important, the effects of long-term stress. On the positive side, the research is clear on this. The phytonutrients, the bright colors in fruits and vegetables are protective. Exercise is protective. You'll see this over and over again. And then cultivating positive emotions. So negative emotions of stress on the one side, but there are things you can do to actually create more positive emotions that make a big difference in whether those genes stay activated or not. A lot of you are familiar with the very good research on gratitude and mood, and I think that's an example of cultivating a positive emotion that is really powerful. Second thing is neurogenesis. And in my view, this simply refers to the fact that the brain is always creating new cells. It's always trying to kind of repair itself, renew or rejuvenate itself. We didn't used to think that. When I was in my training, I think we still didn't understand. We thought other organs, liver notably, the skin, they could regenerate, but not the brain. And we now know that that's not true. There are stem cells that reside mostly in the hippocampus that are constantly producing new cells The big question is, do those new cells survive? And in order to survive, they have to connect to enough other cells, and those connections have to be robust. So that's where we can think about what can we do to actually make a difference in that. Because I think that it's possible for somebody who's had a long-term condition to really consciously work on these things that might create a different homeostasis down the road for them, but it takes a while. I think it takes probably a year or two. But I want to get the message across to those patients that it is possible. And I see this all the time, that it is possible for people to change that long-term pattern if they can find the key and stay with it long enough. So BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is one of the main reasons why some of these cells survive and others don't. So you want a lot of this, and you want your patients to have a lot of this. This is like miracle grow for those new neurons. And here are some things that make a difference in that. Exercise shows up again. And in this case, the exercise does not have to be vigorous. In fact, it seems better if it's not super intense exercise, but it's kind of low level, moderate, mostly aerobic activity. I do need to be upfront about this and tell you that all this research I'm referring to on this slide is done in lab rats. And of course, there is a very big difference between lab rats and human beings. And that is, if you put one of those treadmill things, those circular deals in a rat cage, they will actually use it. Human beings, we know, it's not so easy. But they do. They run, they love it, they'll use it for hours a day. Second thing, an enriched environment. Again, with lab rats, it's kind of easy to manipulate. You give them toys to play with, you give them playmates to use those toys with, and you challenge them. You have them do something that is new, that's novel, that they haven't mastered before, and that is kind of difficult enough that it's a little bit unpleasant. It's really not so different with human beings. We need to be playing, we need to have people to play with, and we need to be challenged to do something novel that is not comfortable or easy for us. Third thing is diet, and you'll see it's very similar to the list before. Not eating too much, phytonutrients, omega-3 fats. Serotonin, turns out, serotonin is an important kind of cofactor or partner with BDNF, and then social connection. And again, in rats, pretty easy to give them that. Now, age is another variable here. As we age, we don't have as much of this miracle grow stuff, this BDNF. So there was a scientist who wanted to know which of these factors, including age, which of the factors are most important for the survival of these new brain cells. And what do you think it is? This list plus age. It's social connection. Social connection beat everything else pretty easily. So even the older rats, if they got to hang out with other old rats, they did better than the youngsters who were running, eating all the right things, being challenged. Social connection, which we know with our patients, is not so easy to fix if that's a problem. But it is such a key. It covers up a lot of other things. I want to say a little bit more specific about exercise. I know that we all realize that this is helpful and important, but I really want to emphasize it as a treatment. So this is the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, recommendations for how much exercise an adult should be getting. And you'll see it's not very much, 2.5 hours a week. It could be only 75 minutes if it's more vigorous, plus some kind of muscle strengthening. I want to share with you a story that kind of changed my thinking about this. A few years ago, I did a talk here at the U of M for an elder hostel group, and we were having kind of a back and forth dialogue about why is depression seemingly more common today. And I said to them that I thought one reason is because life is harder now than it used to be. So imagine this. I'm in a room with people of my parents' age, basically. I already had gray hair then, but they said things to me like "sonny" and "young man," and then they very quickly corrected my thinking by sharing with me how difficult life was for them growing up largely in the middle of the last century, around the World War II years. It made me realize actual stress, really real difficulty is not the problem. The problem, I think, is different than that. It is how we relate to stress, and it's whether we get breaks from it or not. So there's another lesson I learned from this, and that is that even though this was in the Twin Cities, and they all lived in the Twin Cities, most of the people in that room had grown up on a farm. And if you look at this number, 2.5 hours a week of exercise, and you think about just a generation or two ago, we evolved to move constantly, more or less constantly. We did not evolve to be sitting most of the time and moving for 2.5 hours a day. By the way, relatively small percentage of Americans actually get this 2.5 hours a day. But it made me think not so much about exercise, but about movement. And just one study on this, I just find this powerful. And this is a study looking at treatment-resistant depression in people over 65. So as you know, this can be a hard group to treat for depression. And they were treatment-resistant, meaning they had failed at least 2 trials of antidepressants. What they found is the group that was told to walk, they had about a 26% rate of remission. The group that was not given the instruction to walk, 0%, not a single person. Now, this is a really simple, straightforward intervention. It's one thing, asking people to walk 30 minutes to 45 minutes a day, most days of the week. And it is, at least in this study, more powerful than medications. And I think that comes up again and again in the research. And again, any movement. This is Dr. Levine from the Mayo Clinic who created this, the treadmill desk. I didn't see any of those in your offices back here, but I think if you asked your department head nicely, you could each get one. They're only $10,000 a piece. And if you can't do that, try standing up every 15 to 20 minutes and just incorporating as much walking into your day as you can. There's a great book written by one of my favorite neuroscientists, Robert Sapolsky. He says, the book is called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And he says, in nature, you don't see the same kind of stress-related conditions that we experience so commonly as humans. At least you don't see as much of it because they don't suffer from chronic stress. But people do. And I love this quote. I didn't take that picture, but I'm 95% sure it was photoshopped, I think. So Sapolsky says, we human beings have evolved to be smart enough to make ourselves sick. And what I think he's saying there, it is really our thinking about things. It is our worry, our pessimism, our rumination. It's our tendency to create stress even more than is actually there. And that's what we need to be training people to do differently. I also want to really emphasize this. We talked a little bit about this at dinner last night. I have come to see sleep as the single most important variable for good mental health. I say this partly out of my experience with college students because that's an age group when so many people develop a first episode of whatever illness they're going to develop. And invariably, I've realized it is preceded by a significant disruption in their sleep. Invariably. Bipolar illness, if any of you treat bipolar illness, you know how important it is to stay on top of sleep and how sleep is both a trigger and a symptom of the illness. But I think it's a really important trigger. So if I were to start a clinic from the ground up today, I would have virtually every patient have at least a consultation with a sleep expert. I really would. I think the research on cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is so strong, and I see it in my practice. I do workshops on it with my patients a couple times a year about trying to do as much as they can to regulate their sleep, because I think if sleep falls into place, there's a much better chance that everything else will too. And if it's not there, the research on this is quite clear. If people continue to have problems sleeping, their chances of becoming depressed are about twice what they would be if sleep was intact. If they get their sleep intact, their chances of recovering are about twice what they would be if sleep was not intact. I think it's the most important of the lifestyle measures. And then just a note on this, that this is a book about the Sabbath, but really what they're talking about is giving some time to things that are a little bit more internal, more deeper, that are some kind of opportunity to reflect on one's inner life. We don't do near as much of that in today's world as we did even, I think, 30, 40 years ago. And I'm actually become an advocate for boredom, for having time which is such downtime that you get a little bit bored and restless, because I think it's good for your brain. I think it's really good to take time away from everything, including the devices that we all love so much. And then finally, neuroplasticity. I know you're all very much aware of this term. I want to just paint it in really simple terms, because I think this is really key to what we do. Neuroplasticity simply means that the brain is capable of changing and, in fact, of making these new pathways that didn't exist before. As we know, you can also reinforce the old pathways that have been there for a while that are not so healthy. I think of it like this. If you imagine a grassy meadow with long, tall grass that nobody has walked across, and then you walk across it one time, you're going to see a very faint path. But if you don't do that again, if you don't walk across it again, it's going to just disappear. Then imagine that you do walk across that same path. You do it multiple times a day. You do it every day of the year. Before long, it is such a well-worn path that anybody else who comes to that meadow is probably going to take it. I think that is very much like what happens when someone has a first episode of something like depression or a panic attacks. I think it's creating what's at first a pretty faint pathway. And if they didn't reinforce it, if they could learn how not to do that, how to step back, how to work with their thinking, how to see how powerful their thoughts are, I don't think they would create such a well-worn path. So part of our job, this is a really nice way to use mindfulness skills, part of our job is to help people become aware enough. They don't have to be a big Zen meditator. They just have to be aware enough of their own thinking to be able to see it and experience it in real time, to be able to see that I just generated a thought. That's all it was. It's nothing more than that. And learn from that observation that it's possible to step back from it and not engage the thought. I don't think it's possible to not have the thought in the first place. I don't know how you stop that. But once you have that negative thought about yourself or your life, it is possible to disengage from it, just not to entertain it. It's a nuanced, sophisticated skill, but it is a really important skill. And then the flip side, I think, is also true, that if there is a pathway that doesn't exist that we want, such as gratitude, such as self-compassion, loving kindness, those kinds of things are practices. They're simply skills that can be taught, that can be learned, but they have to be repeated again and again. And you can, by doing that, create a very different set of options when something difficult comes along. They can go down a very different path. I want to just illustrate through a study, just quickly illustrate how powerful our thinking is in terms of brain function. This is a study I just find really interesting. It has nothing to do directly with depression or anxiety. It was a study done looking at the size of the cortex that deals with movement of the hand. So in this case, they just used one hand. They asked people to practice this song on a keyboard for a couple hours a day for 2 weeks, just one-handed. And then by doing that, they looked to see if if that practice made a difference in the cortex that controls right-hand movement. Okay, so that was the original study. They did that for just 2 weeks, and they found that that part of the brain grew by about 25%. Pretty big difference in just 2 weeks. Now, to me, that's not surprising. That's just like if you took a barbell in your right hand and you did this 20 times a day, and in a couple of weeks, you're going to have a bigger muscle on this side. But then they did something, I think, really interesting. They asked another group to do the same thing with one big difference. They said, don't actually move your hand. Just imagine it. So they're just picturing this. They're just doing it in their mind. Same deal, 2 hours a day for 2 weeks. They have the same growth of about 25% in the part of the brain that's supposed to deal with movement. I think that just illustrates how powerful our mind is and how much impact what we're doing with it, all of our waking hours, how much impact that has. One thing it does not mean, I want to really be clear about this, does not mean that you don't have to exercise, okay? It just means that the brain and our imagination is a powerful tool. I want to talk briefly about a Buddhist concept that I just think is really useful. It has to be framed properly, but I think it's a really useful concept. And that is what's known as adventitious suffering. And this is really talking about not the initial wound or hurt. That's called the first arrow. And I think if you're out there in the battlefield, if you're living your life, you're going to get hurt. Everybody is. But then they talk about the second arrow, and this is really where a Buddhist or mindfulness practice, I think, gets its power, and that is trying to change this thing called the second arrow. So if you imagine a soldier getting shot with a first arrow, and in response to that, taking a second arrow out of his own quiver and stabbing it into himself, that's the metaphor. And what it really refers to is not what's happening to us in our lives, it is our reaction to it. And it is through that reaction that so many of us are hurting ourselves even worse. That is clearly true for our patients, particularly those with depression. They are taking something, they're turning it against themselves, they're hurting themselves with it. And that's where doing a practice of first developing some awareness, second, developing some capacity to step back from that experience and see it for what it is, and thirdly, creating a more compassionate response, especially when it involves yourself, is incredibly helpful. We know this in part. We know how much you can change your brain by the research that Richie Davidson did at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, looking at monks who were very experienced at doing a compassion meditation. And if you remember this research, what they found is that the monks, within moments, could activate their left prefrontal cortex, which is the one that's more active when we're in a state of openness, compassion, loving kindness. They could do that within seconds of being given this assignment to hold someone who's suffering, hold them in your mind with compassion, with openness and compassion. So it's all they did. They gave them that instruction. Then they took a group of people that were not practicing this for years or decades, and they found they had very little ability to do that. So persons who were untrained, if you will, maybe well-meaning, but not able to, at will, to activate that left prefrontal cortex. However, with just a bit of training, not very much, just a very few weeks of compassion meditation practice and training, they're able to start shifting. Why is that important? I think that this left and right prefrontal cortex has a lot to do with emotional suffering. I think that when people are stuck in that pattern of rumination, slight agitation, self-derision, being hard, beating up on themselves, I think that if you were to measure, you'd see the right prefrontal cortex is way more active. And if you can learn or teach somebody at will to begin to shift out of that into this more open state, and it may take a while, but it is very doable. I think you've given them a huge gift of being able to have a tool that you carry with you that can radically change your moment-to-moment experience. The most important thing, by the way, this is not yet the one thing. I will tell you the one thing. This is not it. But I think that the most important thing for overall mental health is this ability to create connections. The Dalai Lama even says, we can live without religion and meditation, but we cannot survive without human affection. I want to kind of tie this back to the issue we were talking about earlier about our own well-being as health professionals. And my perception is you have a good thing going, at least in the psychiatry department right now, where people are, I think they're feeling good about being there, about being part of something bigger than yourselves. But I really want to emphasize this because I think this is the antidote to burnout, to really struggling with burnout, is to really feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself, that you're not just in your office seeing your patients all the time, which I've experienced. That's a pretty lonely, difficult place to be. But you're part of something bigger, you're part of a team, you connect with each other in meaningful ways, you have conversations that go a little bit below the surface, at least from time to time. I think that's really one of the great ways to keep yourself sustained through a lifetime of service. And then finally, there is one thing you can do. This is a quote by Mark Van Doren, an academic who lived and wrote a few years ago, but he said it beautifully. There is one thing you can do, and the happiest people are those who can do it to the limit of their ability. We can be completely present. We can be all here. We can give all our attention to the opportunity before us. And I want to say that those of us in healthcare, I think particularly in mental health care, we have a beautiful opportunity to practice this because we have this front row seat. We're invited in to have these meaningful conversations, to be with people in some of their most difficult times, and to be present for them in a way that changes their experience of their suffering. Even without speaking, it's possible, I think, to create enough of a sense of presence that just being in a room together is somehow healing. And that, to me, is just a really good example of how to live a medical life well and how to think about what integrative mental health or integrative medicine might mean. So thank you very much. We have a little time for questions still.
I personally want to thank you for ending with this because the whole department knows that I've made a big thing about when we're in meetings, putting down the devices and being fully present with each other. So I just want to say, you just said it, why I think that's so important. I'm just curious about your comment, but even now in our clinical encounters, there's such that pull to get that note written that unfortunately, it's become a tendency to, and how do, I think also we have to do it, as you say, in the clinical encounters, right? Be fully present, not tethered to the demands of this device.
Right.
So more comment, maybe.
No, I hear you about that. I think I actually hear this from a lot of physicians that the electronic health record has kind of gotten between them and their patients, and I think that we have to set those things aside, particularly in our kind of work. Yes.
The on button. All right, good. Hi. One of the things that I often think about, and I didn't hear too much about, is this increase in, like you said, doubling the amount of kids and adolescents that we're seeing being admitted with suicidality, and just this increase in depression over the last, especially the last 15, 20 years. And to me, that also really seems to coincide with this increase in technology being so accessible and basically us walking around with our smartphones attached to our hips. So I'm kind of wondering what, is that something that you talk about, when you're working with clients, like, or do you feel like that's playing a factor? The amount of screen time?
I absolutely think that's playing a factor. I think it might be a bigger factor for what we're seeing with adolescents, even than it is with adults, but I think it's affecting all ages. I think there's a couple different aspects to that. One is, especially with teens, they're on social media, and so they're comparing themselves. And it's just the nature of the brain to compare to others, usually in a negative way, and it's just really a setup for feeling badly about yourself. But I also think there's a way in which simply the engagement with the device, particularly a cell phone because it's so accessible and because you're constantly changing the screen, I think it changes the brainwaves in a way that is, one, it's not conducive to focus or concentration, and then I also think it affects mood adversely. And I also think it affects sleep adversely.
Are there any studies that you could identify about like that? About it changing your kind of how your brain functions?
Yes, there are. I've seen some studies on that. I can't list it off the top of my head, but I know that there are studies looking at how, particularly the rapid shifting of the screen affects the EEG brainwaves. And just putting it into a state where the autonomic nervous system is more activated. Yes.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I particularly appreciate your comments on loneliness and connection. And I was reflecting on, so I'm a child therapist by training, but the patients who are all still on my panel are no longer children, and I'm realizing are all incredibly lonely. And in this day and age of evidence-based care, which is short and time limited, have really struggled with, I'm seeing people for like 5 or 6 years now, and other than me and maybe a caregiver, they're quite isolated. And I would just be curious to hear how you would comment on, in a week I can only see so many people, and I now have 10 people who I've seen for 5 years who don't have many other people in their life. But then
so the question is about the value of that
relationship,
ongoing relationship.
But then also not being available to new patients.
Right.
And there's times where I've sort of thought like I should be moving them on to community-based therapists.
Right.
But
well, I have a bias about this, and you can kind of tell from the choices I've made in my career that I have moved toward greater and greater autonomy, in part because I don't see a way around this question of time. I don't see how we can substitute having sufficient time. Can't give you a number of minutes that has to be, but enough time that you really have a chance to make a real connection, and that you don't feel always rushed and having always running late. And I think productivity expectations tend to be too high, in my own opinion. And I realize that it's expensive. Treatment is expensive. I mean, when I was at Health Partners for a while, I was an administrator. I get the pressures that a system is under. I really do. And yet, I don't think we can ignore the value of time, particularly the value of having a kind of a long-standing, important relationship. All of us have to figure out for ourselves what can we do to balance the needs of our existing patients with other people that really need and want to see us, and that's a hard thing. That's something I've kind of struggled with my whole career. And for a while, I think I resolved that just by working harder, and then I probably did that for a long time, actually. And then, that just doesn't work. So I think part of it is confronting your own limits, what you can do, and I think part of it is the system really does have to, sometime has to acknowledge the value of time and the importance of connection. Yes?
Good, it's on. That's really similar to the question I wanted to ask, but I want to push a little further. You've mentioned the importance of time and the importance of connection. in the clinical setting, but also the importance of social connections. And also the one project you really presented there and elsewhere, you emphasized the importance of finding funding for that. It seems to me, some type of solution to the problem of time is to rely on each other, to collaborate, to make connections broadly, to find time with different people. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or proposals about how that might be paid for, or
how it might be paid for.
Or
I do have some thoughts about that. One, let me just say, I am a real advocate for working collaboratively with others, and with others from different professional backgrounds. I think it enriches everybody. It makes for a better program. I think that's a good antidote for burnout because you're not just doing it yourself. But I also, in light of that, I really think there is a need for more group-based activities. I think there are two reasons that I didn't mention why that group program I talked about was so effective. One is that we did a lot of work on self-acceptance, and I think that's just such a key to recovery. But I think the other one is that without us intending this, there was just a built-in connection and support because they were doing this together as a group and there was a cohort. And I hear this all the time from my patients who go to an IOP program or a partial hospital. A lot of what they really benefit from is the connection with the group. So I think that we in mental health need to be doing more of our interventions with groups and not as much individual, my opinion. I think a lot of that can be skills-based. I think that can be reimbursed as a group medical visit, even if you're not trying to change the insurance system. I think that already exists and is in place. It needs to be understood, and you need to know how to work with that, but it's not that hard. And then I think that our large-scale healthcare system is open and needs to recognize the value of these kind of programs. And honestly, I was really surprised at how easy it was to convince an insurer that's always about denial to do something like this. We just had to sit down and have a conversation with them and show them the data. It helped that Alina is self-insured probably, but I think that there is an openness and a recognition that we need to come up with novel solutions. And if you can show that this might be a cost-effective way, different way of providing care, I think that people will listen.
I guess I'm curious, kind of to change tracks, but wondering how would you best decipher between major depressive disorder and adjustment disorder? Yeah. Set aside the obvious situational factor. But I guess I'm curious what the biggest mishaps you saw with diagnosing people with major depressive disorder.
That's a great question. This is really where my personal bias shows up, and that is that I think we overdiagnose more severe conditions, and I think we do that because of the insurance reimbursement stuff. So I get that. I realize the importance of that, but I think we're doing a disservice if we don't recognize how much the situational stressors are playing into it. So the way I would distinguish between them in terms of diagnosis, the symptoms might look very similar. But I think if you really can get down to understanding what was the cause of this, is this something that they really have dealt with most of their life? It's been recurring. There's a really strong family history. Or did this occur in the context of 2 or 3 or 4 really stressful things that all came together at the same time? And because a lot of my work has probably been with people that are relatively a little bit healthier, they're employed, they have more skills. Even at group health, everybody was employed. So I think I see a lot of people who just become overwhelmed at some point in their life with a coalescing of stressors. That can happen to any of us. but it is a different thing than the person who really has a biological depression. They can have a relapse when things are going just great, and you can't determine any trigger particularly.
So I wanted to thank you, Dr. Emmons, for a wonderful talk and all your questions. We're out of time for questions. If you are a trainee, we do have a lunch with Dr. Emmons, so you can, continue the dialogue there. But thank you again, and I really appreciate you being here.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Connected from the meeting.